But with reservations or not, during May and June 1967, 19 had secured the bulldozers of the 11th Engineer Battalion, 3rd Marine Division, for the completion of the first leg of McNamara's Wall, a swath 600 meters wide cut the 10 kilometers from Gio Lin west to Con Tien. It defined the terrain like an immense dirt runway and was known to the troops as the Trace, the Firebreak, or most commonly as the Strip or the Death Strip. Maintaining the defense of Con Tien shackled 19 to a static and targeted position, robbed them of on and, more often, 2 of their 4 rifle companies to secure that position, and, in some, put them in a defensive rather than an attack posture. Considering that the Ben Hai River was inviolate because of political considerations at least south to north by the Allies, not north to south by the Communists, the initiative around Con Tien belonged not to the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, but to their old friends in the 324B NVA Division. Humping was their word for patrolling, and the Indian country around Con Tien in which 19 humped was gently rolling flatland easing here and there into hillocks. Terraced rice paddies were cut into the slopes, property lines demarcated by dikes on which had been planted hedgerows and bamboo thickets. Slit trenches further defined the dikes, having been dug by farmers to keep the bamboo roots from growing into the fields themselves. Both Marines and NVA used these agricultural trenches. With all the civilians having previously been relocated, the property lines had a new meaning. The hamlets were now burnt and rubbled, and the fields pockmarked by shell craters from a succession of firefights and full-blown battles. What had been a dirt road-connected community of field and farm and market was now a mean, ugly place of wilting heat. I mean your water boils in your canteens, CPL Charles E. Sullivan of C-19 wrote home, and you can blister your hand by grabbing your rifle barrel. A place where the Marines controlled only the ground on which they stood and where NVA reconnaissance teams almost always had them under observation. LCPL Larry Stuckey, also of C-19, commented. Our company movements in the field were very routine, noisy, and much too predictable. The NVA always had a pretty good idea of where we were and our strength on any particular day. They hit us a whole lot more than we hit them. My fire team set up many ambushes trying to hit the NVA. Not once did we ever ambush an NVA unit. About this time, the Marines' old reliable M14 rifle had recently been replaced by the M16, which was lightweight and modern and liked to jam up when you needed it most. Specifically, the brass cartridge tended to expand inside the chamber when fired so that the extractor would tear off the cartridge's base but leave the spent cartridge itself. The next round would then be double-fed into the uncleared chamber. When this happened, and it happened a lot, a Marine would have to push the magazine release, pull the ammunition magazine out, and pull the charger handle to the rear and lock it, then, produce his cleaning rod, beat the mangled brass out of the chamber, slide the magazine back in, allow the bolt to go forward, roll back over, fire another round, then push the magazine release, pull the ammunition magazine out. The Marines were not amused. When the defects of the M16 were publicly exposed after their first major test, the Key Sand Hill fights, the powers that be refused to acknowledge the intrinsic flaws of the weapon. The official line was that any problems with the M16 were the result of the troops improperly maintaining and cleaning their pieces. Such explanations were meritless. Still, the grunts wished to believe they exercised some control over their lives, so, noted HM3 Lindenmeyer of D19, whenever a rare 3 or 4 toothbrushes arrived in a sundry pack there was a spirited discussion amongst the Marines as to who was to get the toothbrushes. They used them to clean their rifle. They cleaned the chamber of their rifle 3, 4, or 5 times a day, and they cleaned all the ammunition at least once a day, in the superstitious hope that if everything was all nice and clean it might actually work. More than one Marine, however, died sitting there screwing together the ramrod for their M16 so as to pound a jammed cartridge out of the chamber. The M16 was indeed a piece of shit and everybody hated it. There were other problems. When PFC Day D. Henderson, a radioman with the 1st Platoon of Bravo 19, originally drew his equipment at the battalion rear in Dong Ha, the deuce gear he ended up with, belts, packs, canteen covers, etc., was just shot, the oldest he'd ever seen. He didn't even have foot powder, and the plastic pouch containing his one and only sterilized battlefield dressing had already been opened. Worse, he was issued only 7 magazines for his M16 and was told that if he put in the 20 rounds each magazine was designed to hold it would overfeed and jam. It was ridiculous, but he never could scrounge up and more magazines. The Marine riflemen along the DMZ were, in fact, so habitually short of things that replacements often ended up with the gear of the most recently killed or wounded. The motto back at supply seemed to be, "You can't waste what you don't have." The next bad sign for Henderson came on day 4 when he and 3 other replacements caught the morning convoy to Contien. The Irish pennant turned them over to Staff Sergeant Burns, who divided the 4 new guys among his 3 squads, and Henderson was shrugged off as just another boot by his new comrades and told that he would be point man on the next day's patrol. They kept their word and Henderson found himself in the absolutely insane position of walking point on his very first jaunt into Indian country. When they stopped to set up an ambush near the strip, Henderson, a stocky, muscular, squared-away kid, set down the radio battery they had him carry and laid out his grenades and magazines before him. Shortly, there was a rustle of bushes, and Henderson was stunned to see an NVAA real-live gook coming into view, a perfect target except that the safety on Henderson's M16 would not budge. As he struggled with his uncooperative rifle, a short-timer Lance Corporal let out a panicked scream, "My God, there's thousands of them," then simply got up and ran away. The rest of the ambushers played follow the leader as Henderson scooped up his grenades and magazines, grabbed the radio battery, and chased after them. Another example of malfeasance, and then, an explanation. One evening at Contien, CPL Harry Montgomery of the 3D platoon of Bravo 19 was approached by a fellow squad leader, a corporal whom he liked. It was his turn to take out the night ambush, but he was reluctant. "Hey, Monty, you know, I really don't want to go out there tonight. I got a funny feeling. You know, could you stand some help standing perimeter?" "Well, first we're gonna have to persuade the lieutenant and the captain not to send you out. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll have one of my men with the infrared scope fire a couple tracer rounds out, and I'll have my line open up. Then, when the lieutenant comes over, I'll tell him we saw some motion or activity along the perimeter. And I don't think he'll send you out then." "Oh man, Monty, that'd be great." The hoax worked, and with 2 squads manning the holes instead of 1, everyone was able to get twice as much sleep as normal. Fatigue motivated most of the misconduct. Such was the relentless pace of operations, and Captain Frank L. Southard, CO. H/2/9, noted, "We were under the hunt to do 3 patrols a day, and although you had been humping through the bush more than anybody could possibly deliver. When the troops get exhausted you really have to stay on top of them because they don't stay tactical during operations. They fall asleep on listening posts, they go out 100 yards and find some place to sleep." It was very, very draining, to the point that we had one man that was really lightly wounded but he was so exhausted his body wasn't up to fighting off the shock, and he died in the helicopter being medevaced. In addition, the supply system was such that the grunts basically wore rags. Because I Corps was the end of the supply line, and the tons of ammunition, food, fuel, and construction material for McNamara's wall all had to be landed across a 100-meter beach at Dong Ha. Even socks were a luxury item at times, and the troops ate virtually nothing but sea rations. Brig Gen Louis Metzger, Assistant Division Commander, 3D Marine Division, at Dong Ha, was well aware of these problems. Metzger had served as a battalion commander in the Marshalls and on Guam and Okinawa during World War II, as well as in Korea. But nothing he saw in those 2 wars matched the demands, in terms of terrain, climate, and days in combat, placed on the individual Marine rifleman in Vietnam. Due to the overcommitment of the division, it was necessary to move battalions from their parent regiments in order to meet the changing tactical situation and the enemy actions. The result was that the teamwork that results from training and working together was disrupted. The troops were exhausted and pushed to the limit. If you are going to fight a protracted war of attrition, you have to have the resources to sustain your people in the field. We were not able to rotate units and provide them with proper rest during this period of time. There were many frustrations to be found along the DMZ. Not only was the 3D Marine Division facing a superbly equipped foe, thanks to the Soviet freighters allowed to dock in Hanoi and Haiphong, but they were combating these regulars along a sparsely populated frontier that Marines Corps would have preferred to have ignored for the time being. At this stage in the war, the Marines wanted to concentrate their efforts on the densely populated coastal regions where, before Operation Hastings had spurred them northward, they had been enjoying potentially lasting and meaningful successes in the pacification arena. Hanoi wanted the 3D Marine Division on the DMZ so that villages once secured by them could again be controlled by the VC, and so that by challenging the Marines in open battle, in circumstances favorable to the NVA, they could deliver casualties that would eventually demoralize the American homefront. The 3D Marine Division was spread thin along the DMZ because Gen. William C. Westmoreland, the theater commander, was impatient with the slow, but steady, prolieve that, given the political shackles with which they had to operate, victory lay in seeking open battle with the NVA VC anywhere, anytime, and grinding them into bone dust with overwhelming U.S. firepower. This premise was flawed in that it overestimated the village security the ARVN could or would provide and underestimated the punishment the NVA could absorb. But even if one were to accept it, its practice provided the 3D Marine Division with one more frustration. General Westmoreland, faced with the demands of 4 corps areas, limited his forces in I Corps. Later, after the 1968 Tet Offensive, when the NVA VC had been battered into temporary submission throughout much of South Vietnam, Westmoreland would deploy substantial elements of the 1st Air Cavalry, 5th Mechanized, and 101st Airborne Divisions, U.S. Army, to augment the 3D Marine Division's war in Northern I Corps. The situation as it stood in the summer of '67, however, was further commented on by Brigadier General Metzger. Obviously, the division was grossly overextended. There was no way we could control with what we had. From the graveyard where Lieutenant King's platoon from Bravo 19 had rested not far into their patrol of June 30, 1967, their sweep continued due west. Several hundred meters of humping brought them into a small hamlet where they found what was not supposed to be there, namely, 3 men, 3 women, and a boy of about 5 or 6, since freshly whittled punji sticks were also discovered. These people were taken with the platoon as Viet Cong suspects as the patrol route now turned to the south. En route, they approached another hutch, and when the flanker on that side, PFC Hendry, was within a dozen paces, someone suddenly appeared from behind a mud wall. On instinct, Hendry whipped his M16 to his shoulder, but he let the trigger go slack when he realized he'd trained his rifle on what was only a terrified boy of about 13 years. With an apologetic look, Hendry moved on. The point team returned to the road that led back to the captain's patrol base. Lieutenant King halted them and called back Sergeant Clopton, who then went back up the column to retrieve Hendry and the other 3 flankers originally detached from Clopton's squad. The whole squad was to escort the prisoners back to Con Tien. Clopton put Hendry on point and told him to step it out because it was already late afternoon and there was no time to waste before darkness closed in. This he did, and additional time was saved because they were met 500 meters from the perimeter wire by the battalion intelligence officer, who had come out with a small patrol. As PFC Hendry would write in his notes, he had several interpreters with him, and they immediately pounced on the prisoners with an onslaught of demanding questions. The squad did an about-face and headed back. Meanwhile, as Lieutenant King's platoon swung back toward the patrol base from the west, Captain Coates supervised the offloading of their helo-delivered evening resupply. The sea rations were then divided up, 3 case per squad, so that as the platoons humped back in each man could quickly picky up his 3 meals, stow the cans in his pack, and re-shoulder his gear. Bravo Company moved on then to a final night position further southeast and dug in as various fire team patrols reconnoitered the paddied surroundings. Like all their actions on this hot, wasted day, this reconnaissance was part of the routine, and other rituals were observed as Bravo Company battened down for the night. Captain Coates called together his platoon commanders, Burns, King, Reyes, and Huff, to discuss their resupply needs, the likeliest avenues of potential enemy approach, the placement of their machine guns to cover such approaches, etc., and to pass along word that they had been designated the reaction force in the event of a ground probe or assault on Con Tien. Afterward, the platoon commander returned to their portions of the company square, and Lieutenant King called up his squad leaders, Clopton, Haynes, and Herbert, and told Herbert to make a fire team available for their listening post while Clopton's squad had the ambush. The LPs went out 100 to 200 meters to monitor those likely avenues of approach and to give early warning by radio should any bad guys actually appear in the night. The ambushes deployed further from the perimeter and, with a full squad, their mission was to engage whatever NVA night travelers might pass by. 1 LP and 1 ambush per platoon. 1 awake and 2 or 3 asleep on the LPs, 3 awake and the rest asleep on the ambushes. Routine. Routine. The only good thing about being stuck with the ambush, thought PFC Hendry of Clopton's squad, was that they didn't have to dig fighting holes on the perimeter like everyone else, although Weldon, Francis, and Watterson, also of the ambush squad, got so jumpy about mortars that they dug in for the 2 hours they had to wait between getting the word and actually leaving the perimeter. They stepped off at nightfall, going cross-country to the northwest back through the location of the daytime patrol base so as to reach the road they had taken out of Con Tien that morning. Their ambush was to be along that road, and Hendry, once again bringing up the rear as tail end Charlie, which was almost as bad as Walking Point, was glad they were concealed by a no-moon night. But the noise of our gear hanging from us would tip off any gunny for 100 meters or so. 500 meters out they came to a tree line that ran on a 90-degree angle from the road, and Sergeant Clopton, who was an excellent squad leader, set in 1 fire team on each side of the tree line and his third to the rear. After a whispered discussion regarding the watch sequence, everyone but the 3 with first watch settled into as comfortable a sleeping position as one could. No one got any real rest, though. The artillery at Cam Lo, some distance to the southwest, began firing illumination rounds, then no one in the ambush knew why, which burst almost directly over their ambush new position, turning the road and field a sickly, eerie white as the flares swayed toward earth on their parachutes. The sudden stadium glare completely exposed the Marines in the ambush. Playing games, thought Hendry, who knew they were in for a nervous night thanks to their own artillery. Sometimes it seemed that's all they were doing out here. 3 caged lions. We'll call Richard S. Spike Skeening, the latest CO of the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, 3D Marine Division, was the oldest battalion commander these men had ever seen. With a gray crew cut, he was short, skinny, and out of shape, as well as being gruff, crotchety, and hard-nosed, a man who approached everything like a pugilist. Behind this, however, was a hard-eyed, stiff-upper-lipped stoic who, as a sergeant of Marines, had been wounded at Cape Gloucester and Peleliu. He had been wounded again as a Mustang platoon commander in Korea. He would be wounded a 4th time, as a battalion commander in Vietnam, at about the same time that the troops, at least most of them, were coming to understand that this irascible old bird of a colonel was also an intelligent, creative, and brave combat leader. Lieutenant Colonel Skeening had assumed command on June 22, 1967, soon after 1-9 had relieved 1-4 at Con Tien. 1-4's time in the barrel had included a 2-battalion NVA ground assault on the 13th anniversary of the fall of Dien Bien Phu, May 8, 1967, which penetrated the perimeter and disintegrated into hand-to-hand combat. 44 Marines were killed before the outnumbered Marines sealed the rupture and proceeded to kill or capture those NVA still inside, while artillery flechette rounds shredded those NVA moving away in retreat. The NVA lost 197 killed, and 8 captured, their bodies hastily and shallowly bulldozed into a mass grave in the perimeter wire. Complete with decaying limbs protruding grotesquely from the thin surface, these dead NVA extracted their revenge if the wind was right to blow their smell across Con Tien. This grave, and the usual Marine garbage, also brought to good old Con T the rats that had a penchant for sea rations, for pipe tobacco, and for biting sleeping Marines in their bunkers. Moving in, 1-9 occupied 2 of the 3 small hills that made up Con Tien, the two that sat side by side, east to west, with a low saddle between them, while the third knob, directly south of the eastern of the two northern hills, was occupied by a detachment of Green Berets and their Nungs. The Marines had so little faith in the Nungs' loyalties and abilities that they erected a barbed wire barrier between their positions and their allies. More coils of concertina ran all around the three hills, and a ring 200 meters wide had been cleared by bulldozing around the perimeter. Through the employment of perimeter mines and fugas, napalm-filled oil drums fixed with a detonating charge, as well as seismic devices and ground radar that allowed grenade launchers, mortars, and artillery to be placed upon unseen but electronically detected enemy night attackers, the NVA were kept out of Con Tien during 19's tenure. Major Danielson remarked, "The enemy made repeated attempts to penetrate the Con Tien perimeter during hours of darkness and were rebuffed in every case as a result of the outstanding defensive network plan which Colonel Skeening had developed. We will never know precisely how many enemy casualties resulted since the enemy always carried away the bodies. There was enough blood on or near the outer wire, however, to indicate that the NVA suffered more than a few casualties." Lieutenant Colonel Skeening's command post, CP, on the western knob of 19's two-hill front, utilized the good, solid timber and sandbag underground bunker originally built by the Green Berets they had displaced. While Major Danielson, XO, maintained the battalion rear in Dong Ha, Skeening had with him at Con Tien 1st Lieutenant Gatlin J. Howell, S.2 Intelligence Officer, Captain James H. R. Curd, S.3 Operations Officer, and 1st Lieutenant Wallace Dixon, CO, Headquarters and Service Company, whose ammunition and supplies were stored adjacent to the CP in the only other timbered, underground bunker on the hill. On the line, Skeening had, as of June 30, 1967, for career-minded officers serving as his rifle company commanders, Captain Albert C. Slater, Jr. had Alpha Company, Captain Sterling K. Coates had Bravo Company, Captain Edward L. Hutchinson had Charlie Company, Captain Richard J. Sasek had Delta Company. Con Tien's two-hill front required only 2 rifle companies. The other toe could not be, as Major Danielson put it, profitably and safely employed inside the defensive perimeter in company strongholds from which patrols and sweeps were conducted. Day to day, the riflemen of 19 preferred duty outside Con Tien to life in a slit trench on a bald hillside that the NVA artillery batteries had had years to zero in on from their emplacements, above the Ben Hai River. The Soviets and Red Chinese had delivered to the NVA an artillery of 85 mm, 100 mm, 122 mm, 130 mm, and 152 mm artillery pieces, as well as 122 mm Katyusha rockets, that the NVA gunners used most profitably. For example, a correspondent described an ingenious technique employed by the NVA heavy mortar crews which involved burrowing a narrow shaft into the slope of a ridge facing a Marine position. Chambers were hollowed out at the bottom of the shaft for the mortar and its crews so that weapon and men would have the whole of the earth above as protection. The fired mortar round flew up and out the camouflaged opening of the shaft. A variation of the technique was often used for the howitzers. The NVA fired their guns at irregular intervals, often in the late afternoon when their muzzle flashes were most difficult to spot, and they pulled their camouflage back over each emplacement after each shot. They built far more artillery emplacements than they had artillery pieces, and they moved their guns every day. They constructed phony artillery positions to be detected by their foes' aerial photography. They detonated harmless explosive charges to simulate muzzle flashes to confuse Marine observers as to where to direct their counterbattery fire. They installed a gauntlet of 12.7 mm, 37 mm, and 57 mm anti-aircraft guns, augmented by Soviet-built surface-to-air missiles, SAMs, to protect their artillery against air attack. The situation was completely intolerable. Denied the obvious infantry solution by the politics of the DMZ, the Marines could respond only with their own artillery. Regarding the results of their bombardments of phony enemy positions, empty enemy positions, and real enemy positions nestled under tons of rock and earth, Brigadier General Metzger commented, "You throw it in the breech of a gun, pull the lanyard, and it blows up and plows the earth and you haven't hurt anyone. It was just unproductive. The enemy can stand any number of misses. We were taking a pretty good licking. They had us pinpointed and everything pinpointed. I mean, they were killing Marines and we couldn't locate them. 18 and 19-year-old kids were getting killed because we couldn't locate this artillery. Our ammunition dumps, our helicopters were driven out, our fuel was burning, and we had to sit and take it because the enemy can stand any number of misses. The Marines of 19 were hacking it. One of the games at Con Tien was to sit at the edge of your slit trench and see who had the balls to fall backward into it last as the artillery roared in, but beneath the brave surface of spitting in death's face, there were deep morale problems, and many a morning Lieutenant Colonel Skeening and his Sergeant Major would move around the perimeter to talk with and cheer up the young Marines. One day, with the same purpose in mind, Gen. William Childs Westmoreland, Comusmac, helicoptered into lonely, little Con Tien. Major Danielson escorted Westmoreland around the perimeter. When a Marine pointedly asked, "General, I lost my best buddy to incoming yesterday, why can't we go into the DMZ after those bastards?" Danielson said, the general's response was, "Son, I wish we could, but the politics of the situation are such that we can't violate the DMZ." Can you imagine how frustrating that response was to a young, dirty, unshaven, bleary-eyed, thirsty Marine? 4. Across the death strip. In the 19 CP bunker at Con Tien during the evening command conference of June 30, 1967, as Lieutenant Colonel Skeening noted, when Bravo Company, Captain Coates, had swept southeast of Con Tien that morning it had left Delta Company, Captain Sasek, the sole guardian of the Hill of Angels. Delta Company had marched back to Con Tien after a 10-day patrol north of the Geo Lin Con Tien Strip. Charlie Company, Captain Hutchinson, which had operated in tandem with Delta Company above the strip, was still in position but was due, the next morning, for a helolift to the battalion rear in Dong Ha for a 3-day stand-down. Alpha Company, Captain Slater, had departed Dong Ha that morning after an abbreviated stand-down of their own and had assumed position west of Con Tien. Come July 1, 1967, Lieutenant Colonel Skeening continued, Bravo Company was to continue patrolling southeast of Con Tien until approximately noontime, when they were to sweep north on Route 561, a sunken cart trail that ran all the way from Route 9 to the Ben Hai River. They were to establish a patrol base north of the strip. They were to be joined in the vicinity by Alpha Company, which was to sweep north in the morning so as to place themselves a kilometer west of Bravo Company's patrol base. Alpha and Bravo 19 were then expected to spend 10 to 14 days crisscrossing the 3 kilometers between the strip and the invisible southern boundary of the DMZ, just as their sister companies had recently done. Such patrol activity was designed to detect the first movements of the latest NVA push and guide the placement of the 3D Marine Division's limited manpower. Although the Marines had come to the DMZ unwillingly, and though once pushed 3 they would have preferred a mobile defense of the region as opposed to the stronghold and barrier approach, the strategy that locked them into place at Con Tien also demanded that they hold Con Tien at all costs. The concrete had been poured, so to speed, and a regimental commander explained, Con Tien was clearly visible from the 9th Marines headquarters on the high ground at Dong Ha 10 miles away. Although Con Tien was only 160 meters high, its tenants had dominant observation over the entire area. Visitors to Con Tien could look back at the vast logistics complex of Dong Ha and know instantly why the Marine had to hold the hill. If the enemy occupied it he would be looking down our throats. Given this assignment, Captain Slater of Alpha Company discussed the area with Captain Sasek of Delta Company. Slater was the most aggressive company commander in the battalion, but Sasek, the most experienced, cautioned him that Delta's last sweep above the strip had resulted in a running series of contacts. Perhaps what Delta had encountered was the advance or reconnaissance party for another NVA assault on Con Tien, and Major Danielson remarked on the remainder of the staff meeting. There was a discussion concerning the use of platoon versus company patrol bases. As I recall, Captain Slater wanted to cover more ground through the use of platoon patrol bases. Captain Sasek thought the risk of separation was too great, especially when operating north of the trace. The decision reached by Colonel Skeening was that platoon patrol bases were okay south of the trace but not north of the trace. Since 19 did not have the numbers needed to sweep and resweep the same areas around Con Tien continuously, the NVA who stood their ground to fight only when they had numerical superiority or a terrain advantage would reappear as soon as a sweep ended, secure in the knowledge that this particular area would lie fallow the few days they needed to lay in supplies or prepare an ambush before the Marines would reappear. To counter this, Alpha and Bravo companies were being sent above the strip hard on the heels of Charlie and Delta companies' withdrawal to surprise an enemy accustomed to Marine routines. On the evening of June 30, 1967, as Captain Slater prepared for their sunrise sweep, he was well aware that the measure many of the troops had made of him was negative. It did not surprise him. Although he was, in reality, an intelligent, idealistic, soft-spoken man of 27, he was also a hard-charging taskmaster. He was a tall, blond, hard-jawed ox of a man who had been terribly disappointed when, upon assignment to Vietnam, his secondary MOS as an AO had waylaid him into a bird dog, for 5 months. Then assigned as aide-de-camp to the CG, 3D Marine Division, he had chafed in the rear with the gear for another 4 months before going directly to the general to explain that he was getting no infantry experience. The general appreciated his elan, pick any company you want. I suggest you go for a company that's up to its armpits all the time so you can get that experience, and the mask that Slater then wore for the troops of his new command reflected his determination that, in Alpha 19 he had inherited, and intended to square away, a mediocre example of what a Marine Corps rifle company was supposed to be about. Leadership was one of the problems. Slater was supposed to have 5 lieutenants, but in fact he had only 2, and his best one, First Lieutenant L. Fagan, 2D platoon commander, had left for RNR just as the company had been saddling up to depart Dong Ha. Fagan had said to him, out of bravado, and in an attempt to get closer to this introverted skipper, "You know, Captain, my girlfriend is a stewardess from Pan American so she's in Hawaii all the time. I can put this off for a couple weeks if we're going on a big operation." "Nah, you go ahead and go. I hate to miss all the fun." Fagan had also hated to leave Slater with Johnson, his platoon sergeant, and Jones, his right guide, honchoing the 2D platoon in his absence. Both were buck sergeants on their first enlistments, and both were combat-worn. As long as I was there to kick them in the ass, they were okay, but left on their own I would have little confidence in them. These guys had had enough. Between Fagan's departure and the company's movement, a new man, SSGT Michael S. Richardson, had arrived to take over 2D platoon. Slater's only other lieutenant, 2D Lieutenant Stephen P. Muller, 3D platoon commander, was not only the product of an abbreviated basic school. Such were the manpower needs of Vietnam, but he had only a month or so in the bush. Muller was a good man and a hell of a nice guy, but he knew nothing of the Marine Corps except the pine trees of Quantico, Virginia. His first command was this one. Luckily for Slater, at least his first platoon was in able hands, namely, those of SSGT H. C. Leslie, a big man and a great, unflappable leader.